You know, it's a give and a take. It's just like, oh, what's his name? Henry Poor says about composition. You know, principality and sacrifice, right? And so the principality is trying to make as much use as we can of the area of the camera, right? And then the sacrifice is the losing pieces of the image. And I thought that maybe what we'd have an opportunity to do here will be to go in and just make a kind of big basic drawing together. And so I'm fully aware that when you're looking at in a lens, you're not getting the same view I am. Everybody who's watching this demonstration can see the point of view that I have, and you'll be able to follow along in the playbook of things. Here's what I've got so far, and I'm just going to hold up some kebab skewers and talk to you as we go. I've got a whole lot of information. Can you see it? All kinds of things going on. And a lot of what I believe encumbers the artist is trying to figure all this business out in some way that's going to help them see. Because, I mean, what if you go in and make every single mark that you see in this area and you get it working beautifully, and then your eye just kind of separates from that and you obsess on this, you know, rightfully so and all that. It's a pretty nice mustache, isn't it? Anyway, when you go in and you look at that and you look at this, and they don't fit. You know, so the whole issue of the harmonization of the forms is really a big deal. And so I have this ongoing, ever more ardent belief that the artist has to be a master editor. Just masterful at your editing. And when I say editing, what I mean is the ability to put in very simple marks and allow those marks to, what I would say, float around the paper until you can get a relationship that's really working. When I glance from my point of view, which is off axis from yours a little bit, I'm looking this direction, and I've got one of the most enriching contours over here. I've got a quite nice zygomatic, if I say so myself, and I've got a beard coming down, and then some kind of, God knows what that is. It's definitely not a fault of mine. Something happening there with plaster, but that's overlapping this. This is behind that, that's behind this is behind that. You see what I mean? So all that is really important, but there's a time and a place for everything. And so what I'm going to do, instead of put it all down, is drop it in. I think that these big pieces are sort of so fundamental and simplified that for me they make for the ideal kinds of lines. They're one of their principal, characteristics is that they point, their directionality. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to try to make these things assemble into something. And you can see one of the things that I've got going on is the way that I've established this. This is a fairly unusual placement because most of us in the great practice of drawing position the subject matter behind our paper, don't we? And when we put it behind our paper, there's a sort of space that we contemplate about depth and about reading forms in space and in depth. But in this instance, partially because of the importance of this discussion, but partially because it is different, I put this cast in front of the picture plane. It might be a useful exercise for you as you set yourself up to become a closer observer of what is happening in your subject matter. When you transpose the information, when you try to pull from the subject matter and align it with your point of view, you're actually kind of drawing in a way what we call sight size. Sight size is the size you see it. It's up to you, whatever you want to do. I would just try to shake it up if I were you so that you work in ways that are very illuminating for you, almost above and beyond the concept because of the situation. The situation of this means sight sizing is almost a requirement. So when I think about the sight sizing of this subject matter, what I'm kind of doing is aligning, you see this mark here, with potentially that mark up and through there. I'll use my pointer. Can you see that? Up around the metal.
Yeah.
And then,
Yes.
I've got a choice to make. I've got the chin, I've got the plaster, which I assume, yes, is on camera. I don't have the shadow. Watch my kebab skewer go off screen, right? So I could either include the shadow, which I might in the drawing, and do it with the screen and make the nose and all that business smaller, or I zoom in with the picture on the video, and that's what I chose to do, was to zoom in. And the envelope, again, is not something that I'm here to tell you is a bad move. It just usually is not the way that I start, because I'm such an internal dynamics kind of person. I think that the gesture of a figure, of a face, of an object, of a drapery, or something, a landscape, comes from understanding lines that inhabit the core, animate the core. Because sometimes an envelope can indeed be a unique way of starting, because what you're really doing over and above the idea of encompassing the object is you're trying to develop a personality of let's say, enclosure. So as I enclose this, the personality thing is there's a bit more over here, and so that just naturally alters the visual weight of this subject matter. And there's a bit more over here, which likewise changes the nature of the visual weight. I'm a proponent of a thing called closure. Closure. What is closure? Closure means that I leave space between marks that are moving toward one another, that are, as some colleagues of mine call it, vectoring toward or away one another. So these two lines are moving toward each other, but there's no point. One of the reasons why I like that way of working is because it gives me some breathing space in the drawing. Where's the word closure come from? It comes from the Gestalt theorists, the people who were trying to identify some sort of underlying psychology of seeing, some way of interpreting what was going on that was almost automatic, unconscious. If you go after the top and the bottom, you could kind of estimate it, and in my view, utilize the straights. And once you get enough straights going, I think what you'll see is a sort of movement. Okay? There's a kind of chiseled movement as I try to practice it. I love this kind of stuff because I feel like I get the benefits of the curve with 2x4s for lines. I'm going to go after some broad and simple markers to indicate the interior. And I'm going to try to look for markers because I'm after straights that have that characteristic of directionality. I'm going to try to look for markers that have a difference between each other. So as I float this marker around, meant to be this, okay? And we've got something happening there. But how great would it be if the summarization or the summary line here was different than the one for that? That would be really awesome because it would enrich the statement of this, as Dean Keller used to say, the overview. And so if I've got a series of lines that appear to be, let's say, kind of in a family with each other, even this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, we could even say 5 perhaps. It'd be nice to have every single one of those its own individual, so to speak. Because, that way you don't go and sort of default to a repetition. You want to make sure that what you've got going has quite a bit of insight and character. The only thing that is ugly is that which lacks character. In addition, I have to say it, I'm going to say it, I always do, too human too soon is something to be avoided at all costs. What is too human too soon? Jumping into likeness and succumbing to the panic which is endemic in a lot of artistic practice. The panic sets in when you realize that the drawing of yourself looks more like Colonel Sanders at this point in time than it does you, which is not a good thing when you're on camera in front of a whole bunch of strangers. But not to fear, right? Because we have closure. And when we have closure, we can go in and we can tinker with this thing. It's almost like juggling. And I think you gotta, one thing about studying art and drawing is if you don't make it fun, and thrilling, you're going to stop doing it. So you got to figure out a way to make it interesting and entertaining. It's got to entertain your very soul, or you're going to be done with it before long, because it'll feel too much like work and torture. And you want to go do something that's recreational. So hopefully you're all beyond that. My markers here intentionally are trying to edit effectively. I'm after what I call the intelligent edit. And what that means is a system of mark making that is going to be insightful enough to grab onto that character that I'm after, but broad enough, simple enough, that I can go in and mess with it for a while, because I am not in a hurry to finish. The puzzle that we're looking at right now, puzzle pieces are about little repetitions of this and little repetitions of that, and that's what delights you in the arts, is how a form here could be so tied to a form here. It's like it belongs to the same fabric or something, as though you're looking at a woven carpet and you have a similar patterning up here as you would have down there. That's what's incredible about the face. I mean, so many of us are out there, but we all look very distinctive and slightly different. And to have something that's a template that's capable of so much manifestation is really quite extraordinary. You should try to entertain as much of the abstraction as possible, because now is the time. And if you get the abstraction going and you start to get a kind of a benefit from that abstraction, then you know you're onto something, and you could actually kind of stick that attitude of searching abstraction out at the beginning of all of your starts. You need to have a flair for the abstract early on, or I think you risk having more of a monolithic process and not enjoying yourself as much. You must enjoy yourself. Yeah, when you look at my lines right here, you see how they're not dark and they're a little thick? I kind of feel like brush strokes are inspiring for early drawing. If you don't feel like you're nailing it, the thickness of your line can give you some space to maneuver. In the beginning, you got to be patient with yourself. If you start one and it's a best guess, a best guess is totally legitimate. Go for it. Nobody who goes to art school, so-called, fits in with anything really. There's a sort of separatist mentality. I think that's a good word. We need some other kind of form of active, engaging, recreational, but also creative endeavor to sustain this feeling. It's like you got to go after it, you got to do it. We have shapes in here. I'm big on the optical first. I would also, and I often do, use the word perceptual. A whole lot of what I'm doing, as many of you are aware, is highly conceptualized, exploratory drawing, trying to understand the interior of the body, trying to understand the way the anatomy works in a detailed manner. And that's different than this. This is beginning with a kind of optical framework. Again, what you perceive. Because there are things that are going on in our eye which are processing. We know this, that we don't just observe and copy, observe and copy. We have to make sense of things that are perceived. And our way of making sense of things right now is to flatly arrange them, get their pitch, which means kind of their angular setting, and hopefully aspire here to get a nice looking relationship. And I'm going to pursue that with very simple fundamental shapes. And they'll have to get more complicated, but I hope that I can vector these shapes in here by thickening things up and understanding a kind of bridge framework that crosses through and maybe helps me distribute them more successfully, the spacing of dark and light. I always will pursue this way of working through both a linear framework and then into a shape framework before I do anything regarding the triangles of the nose, anything regarding the alar cartilage or the nasal bone or all those things that we talk about. So I'm going to squint my eyes down, and one of the things is you can kind of pretend to bridge these shapes because they might help create relationships that may not immediately be evident to you as you begin to set up. I just made myself a unibrow, didn't I? But that's A-okay. My son has a unibrow. He's 11, and I guess that means I had one when I was that age. But what I also see in this is a kind of pivot, which is part of the human system. Everybody's a little bit off. Nobody's perfectly symmetrical. Thank God, right? Because we're all sort of a walking caricature if you think about it. And that makes for great drawing, or great drawing opportunities, as I see it. So if you haven't had an opportunity, maybe some of you have and some of you haven't, there are some interesting photographs floating around the internet of some people's left sides repeated and right sides repeated. The one that comes to mind with me is one of Robert De Niro. And when you look at Robert De Niro's head, the left repeated and the right repeated, you could look it up right now. It's almost hysterical. It's so awesome. It's a business of simplification. Why simplify? Mobility. Mobility is everything. The ability to revise and not to commit until you're good and ready. As I work my way through this blocky arrangement of shapes, they have an obviousness to them. And I love the notion of a set of 2x4s building a drawing. If you look at this and through here, there's so much going on. I could get caught up literally in the weeds here for an hour, but my preference is to essentially scan, look quickly at this, look back at my drawing, and try to establish a direction of shape that will then affiliate with a different direction of shape, and another one still, until the mosaic of the face becomes more apparent in the manner I want it to manifest. I have a Tombow Mono 100 pencil. That's what this is. And the Mono 100 you can see is sharpened with a long point, which is nice because when one draws with the tip, one gets a really sharp line, sometimes a line that makes too much stress upon the paper. And that can incise the paper and limit your capacity with managing graphite. When I, on the other hand, draw with the side of the pencil, I get something that really is more reminiscent of a brushstroke. I'm just using the HB because the camera won't pick up the 2H. We've done this before, and I've had a very patient audience in the past. I look back at the pinned screen, and it looks like there's no lines up there. So I learned that lesson probably a couple of years ago, that I got to draw with something a little more consequential. And so I'm using an HB, and I'm using a blending stump, and the stump is just a piece of paper. There's something also that needs to be said about this business of dark and light, and that is that dark and light doesn't mean shadow and light. When I half close my eyes, those elements of the image and the subject which group with dark, go with dark, which group with light, go with light, because I think if you go with shadow versus light, there's a tendency to second guess your instincts. So if I go in there and I say, I know this is a darker light, I'm sorry for the nomenclature, but a darker piece of the light plane, I'm stuck with lines over here, and I don't want to be stuck with anything. I want to be able to go in and just study the permutations of the shapes as they play out across the subject matter. Ideas of dark and light are going to make you stop and take a second look at everything and say, what is it that I see there? Like along this edge here, what is it that I see? And when I squint my eyes, it's a different phenomenon.
It's about 5 minutes to 8.
I don't generally measure really anything, but what I do practice is an adherence of the paper. You should note, and this is always for me, vertical. So if the paper is vertical, then I've got an embedded plumb off the paper. I do this religiously because when I'm looking for a gesture in a figure, a face, anything, the paper has got to be vertical, or the whole gesture is not worthwhile. It's a worthless endeavor. What if you get the most subtle, beautiful gesture and you look over at the side of your paper and it's off axis? Waste. Whole thing's wasted. So this has to be vertical. And if it is, every decision I'm making is made in the context of vertical. So that's a big thing for me. The other thing I'd recommend to you is to have a mirror. And the great thing about a mirror, what you do with a mirror, the way you use it, is you turn yourself away from your drawing. It's like you look over your right shoulder or your left shoulder and you hold the mirror up to look at the piece in reverse. And while you're doing that, you hold your breath because you're not quite sure what you're going to see. I could begin thinking about how there are certain kinds of alignments which sit below, beneath, or above that are quite helpful. And so I will begin looking at some of these, and through here all the way up to the perimeter or periphery, as well as the periphery up and through here, and how it influences what's going on. Always good to have little markers, you see, that give you character and flair, so that you've got something that's going that it speaks to your exuberance, your enthusiasm for what you've got. Make a statement with your mark. Make a big thing out of a little thing, never a little thing out of a big thing. I'm reviewing my discussion topic for tomorrow, and I stumble upon that wonderful Samuel Palmer quote. Now that I mention it, I have to get it right. Now, watch me screw it up, but I think he says the great landscape painters, because he was a landscape painter, used as much of literal reality as was necessary to make their myth or their ideal, I can't remember if it's myth or ideal, probable. And so it's beautifully said. It's like he knows what he's making is not real. And he knows he has to reference literal reality to turn something into a mythical, a kind of ideal formatted phenomenon, which would inspire other people, their hearts, their minds and their imaginations. But he uses reality, enough of reality as is necessary. And that's kind of the way I think of the languages when you refer to a poetic use of it, how it siphons down excessive descriptive passages into something really vital and illuminating. What I need to do is more of my job here, folks, and just get around and look at everything. And when I do that, again, I've got to say, plumb line opportunities abound, don't they? We've got opportunities for all sorts of things this way and that way, and I can see, you see how this area here now with that gives me something that I can then pull down into the other areas. I don't have to necessarily literally plumb this, but it goes to my point about the perimeter, or as I also call it, the periphery, that there's something more than a framing device going on. It's almost like it's an enveloping scale of assessment. This can evaluate that, and this over here can evaluate that over there, and with the irregular, you get opportunities for comparative relationship. And I think that's very helpful. If I were beginning the process of looking at drawing, I would want to hear as much of that as possible. That way you don't have to invite so much extrinsic comparison, or you don't have to feel like you're looking for something that isn't there. What if we could figure out proportion in a way that proportion is already kind of in the middle of the drawing? We just have to recognize where it sits and use it, like resource it or something. If the shapes, the mosaic, which is a word I think I use fairly often, mosaic of the dark and light pattern has any legitimacy whatsoever, there should be just the whisper of a likeness through the dark and the light shape. There are some fascinating experiences with cast in this. To me, it's one of the things you can gain from the study of cast is greater accuracy through a more clarifying and devoted study of perceptual drawing. To get the shapes working is to get more affiliation without even thinking about it, more of a close-knit network of things communicating to elicit a sense of likeness. However, it doesn't do everything. That kind of flat mapping concept is only going to go so far, and it's just about run out of juice. It's just about at a place where it isn't going to make sense if I just continuously compare raw widths and heights, or make little enclosures here or there, or bridges, as I was talking about. That's certainly a good way to do it. A bridge with a dark here creates an enclosure with a light there, and those are wonderful ways of working perceptual drawing as an exercise. However, we have reached that point where it's time to begin thinking about the surface center or something like that. So if I put something in there, which is meant as more of an emphasis for this discussion than I actually see, its job is to say, wait a minute, we're also thinking about the sagittal midline, which is what this is also called. The sagittal midline of the human face. And the sagittal midline of the human face has its own set of demands over the arrangement and disposition of the framework. The septum, the columella, which is what this thing is called here. That column which pops out like that is called the columella between the two nostrils. That there needs to be an arrangement in a thoughtful way between what's happening there and what's happening here, and for that matter, what's happening with all of this stuff, which up to this point has been little more than calligraphy in a sort of shattered, broken sense of patterning. If those things are in any way educational, they should go into asymmetry. Again, this is the reason why I chose this life cast and not a classical cast. The idea is to play with that sagittal midline to see if there's any kind of strangeness to it, because you'll see it in life drawing. You'll see it in your own face. You may see it more and more in your own face if you're me. Structural shape would be embedding the shape with landmarking of a constructive nature. The sagittal midline indication within the shape. The indication of the existence of the mental tubercle here for the jaw. A lot of us know about the mental tubercle now because it's the dividing plane between this surface here and this surface here. And you have to come up with something. Remember, you can't draw with nothing. So something's got to go in there and represent, or it's going to be a long night. And I'm hoping a continuance of intelligent editing and not idiotic editing. We don't want that. There are different sequences and different artists' processes that we all want to sort of explore and experiment with. And, you know, the right kind of insight introduced at a time in your process when it undermines another insight is the wrong time, is in some ways the wrong decision. And what you're looking for is your own way of making all these insights and layering them so that your drawing is peppered with this sense of insights that complement each other and build with each other. It's like a big relay where the marathon ends and everything that you had done worked perfectly in sequence with the next decision. And that's just, you got to find that on your own. But you'll get great insights into looking at different sequences, different processes, different strategies for how to work all this stuff out. Somebody had said to me in the anatomical drawing class not too long ago that they really appreciated that I wasn't trying to make them draw like me. After I quelled my anger, just kidding, I said, you know, that's what you want to find an opportunity to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to voice your own work, because otherwise you're going to draw in so much the manner of me that you won't be you. And you got to be you. And it's interesting that we use some of the same tools. Everybody's going to use the midline. We have to. But sort of when you use it and how you use it is your own affair, just so you know what it is and how you can govern it. So when I put it up and through here, it might be through the indication without even a line. I could put a line there, a very thin line, but I don't really need it because I can see what's happening. Maybe what I could do is just introduce a very light, perfunctory kind of mark right in through there, which will allow me to locate it and then work the so-called symmetry off of it so that I can guide those decisions that were early on only about broad rhythmic relationships of shape into a more considerate and thoughtful framework, pulling up and through here. So all of that is a sort of an envelopment, and in some respect a kind of a base boundary if you pull the sinus into things. See, it's in there, and I may choose to emphasize it or not to emphasize it, but it's absolutely going to be something that refines these shapes because they have to abide by the structural truth, and I believe that truth is more guided by bone structure than just about anything else. So if I follow that up again, then I find opportunities to draw into a unison a lot of what would seem to be disparate parts of the region here. And I also find opportunities to pull things together here, not only with respect to what we would call an eye and a socket, but we would also call cheekbone, especially if we can find a little containment line. It may not be very evident from the camera here, but there could be a possibility of separating the juncture here of that zygomatic from the area that is more medial and through here. And that would be through a base boundary. So I could insert it there if I want to. The way I draw, I tend not to overplay the base boundaries at this phase. They're just, again, they're drawn by inference in the shape, I hope. They're organizing. This is another great example. If you can see it in the photo, you may not be able to see it from the camera, but where the light and the shadow change right here, perfect base boundary. So if I'm up in, in the heat of battle, so to speak, and I pull an angle, I begin to imply a sense of base boundary guiding or refining the shape, which will separate the feature from the foundation that sits underneath the feature. Another good example over here. Something can function more like a base boundary and through there. The eye relationship is a sense of the oval. Yeah, very importantly, it's that covering system there. And that's something that the classical form treats with a tremendous amount of poetic license. So if I were to put in, again, for a locator mark, just a slight amount of tone, appreciate that what that tone is doing is not really shading and modeling the form. It's trying to understand how to separate these pieces into almost hierarchical forms. Like this is the soft, and what you start to encounter over here really is the hard framework. That could be a kind of locator and separator mark that I could use. As I move down in through here, see, a lot of what I'm getting is the hair hiding that, but I see right through the hair. And within this shape, our job is going to be to flesh out literally the bone. It's got to have that insignia, not just the framework, but there's something that's immobile in there, which we love, because that's stuff we can rely upon. One of the things I'm going to search out in this light indication right here would be the existence of that bony framework. And it begins to happen ever so slightly right there, which is a good thing. And that means if it happens here, I've got to also make it happen over there. And you see, it's a far less successful version on this side, partially because of the arrangement. In a design sense, we must never forget the importance, the vitality that design imparts on things. And I think what I want to do with this is arrange midlights, or whatever we call these, over here in a way that they can help draw the socket for me. If they do that successfully, then sort of drawing by inference, as I indicated before. I've always been the kind of individual who feels very strongly about the blending of these two methodologies of seeing and also contemplating. If I get too much eye socket, I usually lose the likeness. If I get too much shape, I usually lose the structure. So I need to have both of those. And that's why I'm kind of filtering now the shapes by thinking about what they're supposed to represent. That this is going to be promoting a soft form right here that has to work in the confines of its container. So I'll push some of these pieces of dark around. This happens to be a big flaw in the plaster, and I don't quite mind it really. It could be almost a good preparation for somebody who comes in with a piece of jewelry right there. Who knows? Could you get that? This would go not only to the corner, but to a lift where the shape would start to feel a little more like I'm interested in the planar construction, or I'm interested in the relationship that this would have with that corner of the mouth down in through there, or corner of the jaw, I should say. And then again, it's important to figure out what is there for sort of flourish and what's there for foundation. And the foundation stuff is how to flesh out the bone structure and the big planes. That's for foundation. This is for foundation. This is going to be fundamentally important. This is where we would get our framework and our landmarks. So I need to figure out where my best estimate for zygomatic is going to be. You know, it's in there, but it's not one singular point of reference. It's a kind of understood region. That's the way zygomatic is. So hard to draw. Probably the hardest part to draw on the face. And if I get it working, it's not going to be because of one point. It's going to be because it should feed the same logic that feeds this marker and that feeds this marker. So those pieces are going to have to be guided into place. So the goal I have is to pursue things a little further and to underscore the discussions about the instrument of structure within the beginning phase of drawing. Anticipate a lot of subtle corrections here. It may be at times it's hard to decipher what it is I'm doing, but I'll try my best to explain what's going on. I want to actually apply what we're talking about this evening to the next homework so that we can get a little more deeply into the idea of the structural interpretation. I want to pursue that a lot. I noticed a couple of things that are really wrong with this drawing, and it has to do with my perspective. It probably has to do with me talking too much as well, because I think the oratory in the middle of a demo has become an increasingly important part of a clear explanation. It's really important to me to be a good communicator. That's why I'm so mindful of the issues related to this crash that nearly killed me a couple of months ago. I am seeing a brain injury specialist, seriously, and I'm going to see a neuropsychologist next week, and I'm monitoring it. But I want to make sure that my wording is very clear to you and that you've got what you need when it comes to a set of tools. And I'm paying a lot of attention to this in the in-person classes as well, particularly with anatomy, because anatomy, it's essential, it's vital that I land on the right wording, the right terminology, whether it's medial, whether it's adductor, all sorts of things are very important. So I've been monitoring this quite a bit. And I want to make sure that I'm clear about the image as I have encountered it returning to the drawing. So I see some issues around the right side, which are based on inaccuracy. I see some issues down and through here, which are also inaccurate. And it's really a testimony to the power of having a fresh eye. That's going to be my first point this evening, is to have a fresh eye. What I'm really getting at is my students in the in-person class setting, folks, have a tendency to sit and stare at their painting on break, almost as though they're scowling at their painting on break, almost as though they're angry at their painting on break. And I believe, and I think that what I'm talking about here affirms my belief that you've got to give your eye a break. You've just got to give your eye a rest. If you don't give your eye a rest on break, then you're not really disengaging and returning to the work at hand with a fresh eye. And therefore, it's going to get worse and worse, and you're going to get more and more frustrated with it, and you might then return to it with an even greater scowl as your face contorts and you sort of make all sorts of obscene gestures of the drawing to try to make it better. They won't work. You've got to give yourself a fresh eye. So one of the better ways of doing this is to have a mirror. That's a terrific way to have a fresh eye. But probably the best way of all is when the model's on break, you just kind of step away. Turn your attention to something else. Even check your phone while the model's clothed and come back to the intensity of the moment armed with some sort of objectivity about what's wrong and what's right. That's what I'm seeing when I come back. I see this is an issue, like I said. This area here is problematic, and I could have gone in and messed with it before our class, but I decided not to because I thought maybe there'll be some sort of a helpful lesson in this where I'm trying to retool things here, revise, and make some changes that will perhaps help you as you're making changes of your own. Your eye has a kind of shelf life. There's just no doubt. It's got a shelf life. And this is when, and I've been mindful of the shelf life for a long time. I used to say in the in-person league classes, don't try doing brand new things the last 30 minutes of class. See if you can just tidy up what you have going already and get it ready for the next session. What do you want the piece to look like when you return to it the next session? That's what you should be thinking about right now. Because if you try to make some kind of grandiose measure, your eye is exhausted. And it's harder for your eye to accomplish that feat. And I would find that to be very good advice. Just in case the feel is different, I've got an F, which is a great pencil to use for structure. And F always gives you really crisp lines, clear lines. So I like Fs a lot. And I use these generally in the anatomical drawing class. And then I've got a B pencil, which is another older one. And the B pencil has a really nice mask capacity. It puts down big areas of shade really quickly. It's really F, HB, and B. When you come to a class, you come as a participant and not as a passive learner. That I really want them to utilize me because I want them to recognize one of the tenets of Dean Keller's book where he says you have to be mindful when you're starting a drawing of what you mean to say with the drawing. And I think similarly, you have to be mindful of what you want to say with your abilities as you acquire these hard-fought abilities. If it's a matter of just simply a deeper appreciation of nature, that would certainly be enough. But I think that the more clear you are what you want to do after the fact, the better a learner you're going to be because you imagine yourself taking a direct action and hitting the ground running, so to speak, as you acquire new ways of seeing, visualizing, of memorizing and performing as you interpret what's going on in front of you. So I just made a big change. Can you see this marker right here? The marker that I have right there is equivalent in the cast to this marker here. I'm not sure if you're seeing that. That marker is tiny, all right? That marker is really tiny. So I've got this eraser. It's an eraser that is a refining eraser. It's almost like a penknife eraser, and I can use that to emphasize the marker because I'm making more out of that mark. Can you see that? It's barely noticeable on the cast. In fact, I just left a piece of eraser on it. Okay, so when I put that together and insert that, it lifts up, and I'm noticing that the more I lift that marker right there, the more the entire effect of the cast and of the drawing is going to be to turn up like this. And that's another problem that I have with my image. My image does not assert that position in space. So I want the shapes to begin to feed my ambition for perspective, the perspective of what's going on. Instead of putting in a block right now, I love doing blocks, you know me. I'm going to wait on that and see if I can get the most out of these generalized pieces because I'm still after a very effective simplification, which I've been calling the intelligent edit. I have another marker, which is approximately right about there, in the shadow, which to me is the equivalent for the nose that this piece is for the mouth. And what is that? That is the suggestion of the midline. You can draw them in, or you can attempt to infer them, or to even literally subtly suggest them. And this would be a way of subtly suggesting a surface center. What I could do is make a little split in my nose, which is slightly more apparent than I see in the subject matter. You can see that right there. And if I overdo it, then, so be it. But I want to make that point because this is part of the mechanism of lifting and addressing perspective. That's the point I'm trying to make. It's like the edit is totally an interpretation, but so are the anatomy books. So is Luca Cambiaso, right? So if they can interpret, we can interpret, as far as I'm concerned. Our interpretations now are different than theirs used to be. Descendants from now, going into a future generation, they're going to see things differently too, right? You can see when you start moving shapes around very simply and blocky and all that, you do get a very different looking guy here, in this case. And you can see that as I'm laying this in, it's totally fine by me to assemble several different markers that will suggest a curve. And I'm hoping that they suggest a curve more successfully as I go through, partially because I'm aware that I have to be thinking, can you see this on the camera view or not? This piece, that piece, this piece, that piece. There's a number of different markers in there. Or you could go in there and look at 34 markers. But I think efficiency is part of our industry right now, wouldn't you say? If we can boil things down to an efficient way of going about our business, then we can kind of have a better time. It's almost like we're investigators and part-time caricaturists as we look at the human figure and pose. and I'm aware of a general trajectory between the eyes. So I've got a really deep marker right there in the eyes. And I also have one here, but the one on this side, on the left, the visual left, from my standpoint, is far darker. And you can see what I've done. I distinguished it previously, probably too much in terms of a lift. So I'm going to drop that. And I want to see when I redo it, is there some kind of an alignment that I'm getting a sense of? This goes back to the notion of perspective. I'm kind of eye level with the eyes of this figure. And so I may not get fortunate in that regard. But at least I'm on the lookout, you know? Because if you see any of this or any of that, you got to go for it in the figure. You have to. Because it's so pictorially important to get the perspective to work out. They're fundamental to the entire assembly of this image. They need to function, to operate. And if you sit on those things for a few minutes and see them as guide points, they're like the steering wheel of the drawing. You could try it out and say, well, maybe I'm just slightly higher than my subject matter. And if I am, perhaps I could get away with subtly dragging this corner down to implement a certain kind of perspective in the image, so that I've got a what I would call a lift on this side and a drop on that side. So if I can get that to work, and if I can get some sort of a marker down and through here to work with a marker up and through there, and that's what I mean when I say the steering wheel of the image. Notice this on my, hopefully I got the levels right with my camera. I try to make sure that vertical is vertical. And what I'm after is not vertical. That's vertical, it's a little bit off vertical. It's really important too, because I'm about to go into the asymmetry of the figure. The modulating asymmetry has to be built on an awareness of perspective, or the modulating asymmetry will go completely crazy. I'll talk about that asymmetry in a second. Before I get there, I'll underscore this again. If this is vertical, kind of like that, this very slight pitch change is the perspective question of vertical arrangement. And then in terms of horizontal, I go from pure horizontal down a little bit further like that. So it's really important as you're drawing your cast that you take measure of where you want to set your head in space. Just in case you're wondering, that may be one of the best things you could ever do. I keep encountering that as a tenet of more successful painting practice. I want to make sure that I get the right amount of space down here to suggest the position of this subject matter. So once I set up those long axes, then I can begin to address this thing that we call modulating asymmetry. So how does that work? Essentially, you have to believe, as I do, that nobody has perfect symmetry in their face. I don't know if you buy that, but I've been looking at a lot of faces, and I'm so happy to report that most people are subtly asymmetrical, and some people are wildly asymmetrical in their configuration. The way that you would play up on that is you'd start to become aware that there are certain pulls, I would call them pulls of form, where form is redirected in the human face. And I'm going to see to it that I at least address some of one in through here that appears to be happening. And when I say that, I mean I'm now breaking away from a kind of a perfect symmetrical read to something that's being pulled that direction a lot further. So I'm going to see if I can mark that out in my cast here, my cast of me. And in this depiction, I'm going to see if I can mark almost what would constitute a corner point, a point of relationship right around chin. And if I go in there and kind of darken that down just a bit and separate the value there from the overall mass of value, that might be a good setting mechanism for you in your drawing, where you go darker, not because it's darker, but because you're trying to guide things differently. So let's go ahead and do that in the key points we've already addressed. Let's go ahead and do that here. Let's do that again here. Let's mark it out right there in the shape. Let's mark it here as well in the shape. And you can see where I'm going with this decision. I'm going to go to the corners of the chin because the corners are probably more critical than the center of the chin or the sagittal midline that exists in the chin. Pose those in this little mass here and adjust your edit accordingly. That's what I would say. So what does that mean? It means kind of creating something that feels slightly rounded and yet still being dedicated to the light and shadow delineation. So I'm going to go in and do that and then shift some of the angles around too, because I'm thinking about last week's discussion or 2 weeks ago regarding not repeating angles. You know, the echo is fine, but sometimes if you make the same angle over and over again, there can be a feeling of a less dynamic form passage. One develops a feel for the surface. One develops a feel for the canvas, as any of us would imagine, or for the paper. And it just so happens that the paper always feels a little bit different. And I think it has to do, and I kid you not, with the water content in the paper. Paper is, I think, approximately 5% water, but it varies from time to time. In the summer, sometimes it feels literally like I'm drawing on a washcloth. It's so damp. And so I never quite know how things are going to feel, which is why I'll generally begin my procedure with several different pencils, because I'll start out with an HB or an F and I'll start thinking, well, maybe I can get away with a certain kind of mark, a crispness of a mark, which is achieved by a totally different pencil various times than it is at other times. I find that just totally intriguing because I think it's an unpredictable and delightful way of trying to synchronize with the surface from session to session. What I often will try to think of is my role as an instructor. It's very different to talk about work with somebody who expects to get a critical set of insights, feedback that is designed to make them feel like what they've done is inadequate. And it's because they're in a very vulnerable position. I never really realized that when I started teaching. I just thought, just say what was up. And I think I offended a lot of people for a long time because I didn't have an appreciation of the importance of communication. And so what I will do with a person's piece of work, even though they tell me sometimes, just give it to me severely, nobody really wants that. They really want to get constructive, applicable feedback. They want feedback that really helps them immediately. And so I'm a kind of good news, bad news teacher. I'll say something that I genuinely feel is positive about a piece, an exercise, whatever you want to call it, and then I'll say something critical about it. And so what I do on myself when I have a terrible day is I look for the same thing in me. I'll say, well, damn it, I wish I'd done that better. That's a mess. But then I'll say, at least I got this. At least I did that. And I think you can rest on that. You can walk away from the situation feeling, like you're not just in a cliched world saying that you want to keep a positive attitude. You achieved something. So you got to be honest with yourself about the things that you did right, the things you didn't do as well as you wanted to. What I think began to happen was I recognized, like I was saying earlier, that there was a guidance system alive within the network of marks. And the guidance system has to be there at all times. Mainly after you begin something, it has to set in. And I'll use that word again, be inferred, because if you're targeting an organizational principle, a very specific perspective organizational principle, then you can take these parts and manipulate them into that principle and see how they set up. I think that's one of the ways that you and I, as people that operate with a binocular sense, can reconcile the fact that we're seeing part of the image at this perspective and part of the image at that perspective. We somehow have recognized in our mind how to blend those two and see around, as opposed to a camera, at least a traditional camera. We're looking around form and we're recognizing parts of form that need to be pulled together into something. So I think there's a bit of that in my efforts, and namely, when we go into this portion of what will become the eye, I edit things down to a point of recognition where I believe, let's say, the kind of center of the eye is going to exist. So I could underscore this with the stump a little bit. There would be a specified marker that you see I'm making more out of right now. And that marker would indeed be a surface center in a manner of speaking. It would sit in that area and animate that area in a way that needs to feel consistent with the perspectival arrangement. It's a very difficult thing to do because there are references to this in Vanderpool. You notice that the way the eye is arranged is fairly diagonal in the sense that there's a marker that's a bit like this, and then there's another part of the eye that goes that way. These are really tricky for those of us who operate more two-dimensionally. I can show you here. So this takes me down to the inference of that, let's say, hopefully center part of the eye in the shape. And then this other marker takes me into that range there where we have a triangle. It's that triangle right there. Do you see it? It's an incredible piece of the human face. That's the lateral third of the eye. That's what Vanderpool says belongs to the side plane of the head. I will sometimes hatch in the observation of that triangle. I'm doing that here. The great part is if you begin to think about the side plane of the head, you know what limitation that is. That's temporal ridge. So I can change the direction of my hatch here and start to pursue the hatch going up into and around in this side plane compartment there. And you can see on this area it's going to be even more fun. I'm going to shift, and I'm going to shift again, and I might shift again this way in an effort to once more capture as much as I possibly can the side plane. I'll underscore that too so I can show you there. So no, it isn't just when you're straight on. They're often there. It's good stuff, you know. This is a great marker right here in everybody's eye socket. This one and that one are perspectively just super difficult to try to grab. So now that we've done the markers for a few of these areas, I should probably point this out. I may need to just indicate very, very lightly that there appears to be a midline, a sagittal midline going that way. There appears to be a sagittal midline going this way, so you can indicate it and then maybe get rid of it. And there appears to be one in this region here, which then kind of sort of redirects itself in that manner down through the face. And I'm certain that there's something about ranging those parts with these outside pieces of the face in some way harmonic to the cheek area as well as the socket. I think all of that has to work together in order for things to arrange themselves effectively. I'm still wishfully thinking too much when I try to arrange these shapes of the eyes. They really are at quite an angle. And if I rearrange them to the angle, I want to go back and make sure that they subscribe to the right perspective. So when I put that together here and there, it should help a little bit more likeness there. And then if I can just underscore this a little bit more, I'm going to drop an arrow right here, all right? Little arrow going that direction, okay? And I'm going to pursue the markers like this one here as though they're part of the reverberation or continuation or otherwise conduit that's inspired by the arrow, which I can go north with or south with, obviously. And so as I continue to look at that and study that, I want to say a thing or two about this. It's as though every face has a kind of circulation, like a piece of fabric with certain points that are more tense versus more points that are loose. And it's part of what makes portrait drawing just completely engaging. There's nothing like it. And so when I'm trying to decipher the circulation of the face, I could go in and do the structure thing, which is what I set up here. And I probably will begin with that. And yet once that's engaged, it's going to be far more interesting for me and far more conducive to helping me understand hair, to look at this circulation, as I call it. This may be a little bit of a weird and wacky idea. Forgive me if it sounds too arcane, but I do believe in it. I think there's something about the natural setting of forms. Like you look at somebody's beard when they show up at your demo, and they've been sitting there in the chair scratching their beard, and everything just kind of fits, because it's rolling together. It's in this conduit. It's in this kind of relationship. And so as you're putting these things together, you don't necessarily have to draw what I'm drawing in, but I do think it's in there. It should be in the shapes, the way that you feel out the positions of these nodules again. This, another one, just like that one, just like what's going on in through here. Well, big shape connections that feel like they belong to a larger system. So for example, there's something here right where that it can be delineated that I did not delineate prior to, that might be sort of part of the, if you grant me this, a sort of form narrative, like the way that there's a build out here could be related to some of that. If it isn't, it isn't. But at least you go in there and try to establish a comprehensive network of things moving. Because I'm already aware that this part here is peaking to the left. So that's probably related to this idea of what naturally ebbs and flows in this example of a human face. Well, there's a lot that is still center when you move past center. I don't mean to speak in riddles, but I'll tell you exactly what I mean. This form and this form here, this one, all right, and this one. I mean, I cannot help but think about rectus abdominis, the stomach muscles, the longitudinal stomach muscles in the human body. And the fact that there are two of them, doesn't mean that I have to disengage my fascination with center line. Now it's just I'm thinking about this one and that one as they exist in an offset way to the midline. And likewise, down in through here, I've got a piece that seems to really want to be noticed. I always feel like forms in the human body are vying for your attention. They want to show off. You think about some of those vein muscles. Sternocleidomastoid, what a vein muscle. But also I think vastus medialis, with its gigantic teardrop, wants to be noticed. But this idea of a form there and a form here, I think are related to the idea that I'm trying to posit, which is that just because that exists doesn't mean I have to forget it when I'm over here and when I'm over there. In some ways, these are designed to assemble a certain piece of form on either side of that midline that would seem to be better understood if I could organize both of those forms off that midline. So if I continue in that, I should be able to locate a few other markers too. There's something going on here that feels quite a bit like that, except that it's lower. It's like a kind of confluence of a different sort. This one's a little bit lighter. It splits into two pieces. So I'll see if I can organize those here. So if I go after that, I kind of need my steering markers, my accents, and I think I need an accent to go darker right about in through there that will help me position this piece in a more upright or higher spot than that piece over there. So the hatch marks that I'm using now, I made the statement earlier that you don't want to overstress the shape. The shape is going to give you about as much as it can give you, and then it's sort of done. It's a hard thing to put into words, but the more you press on one principle at the absence of all the other principles, the harder it is for that principle to deliver, because it only has so far it can go. And when I start dropping in these hatch marks, their first concern or preoccupation is just going to be, for me at least, to travel around and test out a surface that I think I could work with. I'm just going to fall into a instinctive mark, a natural mark, I would say, that I think might be conducive to surface description. I'm going to drop in through here. I know that some of this will shift because it will turn into more of a surface just because I'm aware of it. I know that if I imagine going up here and touching that surface, I might use another pencil here, touching the surface, that would probably be the appropriate mark to make this happen. So therefore, I'm going to dive in and just ever so slightly issue that mark and see if that mark will do some of what I want it to do. I think it will be fine, because I notice that as I shift over, and I'm just going to show you these a bit more clearly. By the way, I shifted my pencil to an F for this so I could get clearer marks. You can see the marks are more, hopefully, they're more clear on camera. But if I go in this direction now and I just gradually move, this is one of the things I just love about drawing again. It's a flurry. It's like even though you could be very purposeful and targeted in your efforts, you still wind up with a certain kind of degree of expressive content in the way the marks are being wielded. I could almost default my way into modeling form here. I don't think I'll do that, but the hatch mark quickly accelerates what's going on. The mass quickly accelerates going on. So the reason why I think it's capable of doing that is because it's so linked to the shape. The shape in the initial phase of the drawing is such a perceptual way of looking at the drawing. It's great because of that. So if I go after some of the shape here and some of the shape in there and just underscore it and try to assemble some kind of a rhythm that drives that direction, I haven't lost my structural advantage. I'm still challenging myself to say that some of these parts of the shape, and I'm talking about that, parts of that, are more important than other parts. And there's no doubt that there's going to be a part right in through here that is super important to it because it begins to deliver it back down to this core. Talk about triangles. This is an amazing one going down and through here that includes this. So we're here down to there. We all know that, but it's just neat to have it adjacent to the one we talked about earlier this evening. But then there's going to be that sort of flurry of marks again that will bring some of that closer. And the mark making that I'm trying to employ in here will go back to and attach itself to that marker in the structural shape, like right in through there. So with any luck, there's going to be a certain kind of effect where that eye is being pointed by that marker. And I should probably go in and adjust things here. I think I'll probably do this by lowering the mark there so that the two, I'm talking about this one and this one, can get a little bit closer to each other and give me a sense that that form of the eye is falling. I still need to do more of that, so I'm going to go back to this other mark here, and I'm working an F, and I'm going to lift this, and I'm going to drop that. And that should even more thoroughly issue that sense of the falling eye. I think that has that's looking better. So I'll go to the other side, the so-called reciprocal. I'll drive in some of this marker, underscore that with the shape. Why am I doing that? Because it's the counterpart to this one. It's the counterpart. So there's a piece of, what do you call it, plaster there. And I think just beneath that piece of plaster is the thing I'm looking for, right here. And I love the fact that these are asymmetrical. I'm going for it. And then I'm going to drop in through here. So this should be something that's quite helpful to me, because what it can do is it can give me an acknowledgement of where that lid is going to be sitting. So I shift my angle here from there. That way I can build the curve. I'm on the prowl here going through this big planar area. So I make a marker there, which is different from this marker. I carry that up into the nose area, so it's all similar. And then I'm just going to continue what I'm doing, as you might imagine, down through here, different direction, so that I can move up and over. Again, sort of about that circulation thing that I was talking about. Maybe the circulation is this direction, that direction. It depends on, what you're going for. Good thing is I'm not really kind of too worried about the value. I know the tone is pretty dark right now, but it's easy to manage because I could just go darker with the darkest pieces. And the point that I want to make about this is we're sort of continually building indications of structural alignment or intentional misalignment by going in there and selecting editing down at will what's happening, because these are all going to be bases for detail. It's like in some ways, the earlier stuff we did together was the trunk of the tree. Now we're putting on the branches. And then later on, if the branches look decent enough, we'll put the leaves on top of that. That's how I see it. More of a structural indication right here. Not really being done because it's a curve, but because it feels like there's something important about the way it relates back up toward the center. This marker became very important and very, very much apparent. That marker right there. So that's another one of those structural center parts or surface center parts. Happens to sit underneath of this surface center right in through here. So it's in the shape, you see. This is the whole point of the demo, to embed your shapes with little indications that feed them into the system that you're trying to structurally build, you know. It sounds a lot less artistic, you know, when I try to describe it, but, you know, what can you do? And then you can see how much exaggeration I'm placing on this, so I need to be a little less flamboyant with that mark. And at the same time, notice that that mark is going to be dropping slightly. I'm talking about this piece right here, that it's going to be dropping slightly. And I think that's just plain interesting. So I'm going to see if I can go in and underscore that. An interpretation, once more, for the purpose of aligning the elements and making some sense out of things. So it's weird, you know, we're drawing what we see, but we're applying interpretations at all times. And this is where I think a lot of the things that I heard when I was beginning to learn to draw and to paint about how people that it would do representational work were just imitators of what they saw. And I think this really proves them wrong. Because how can you just be an imitator? I don't know. Maybe trompe l'oeil is the imitation that they're talking about, but just about everybody I know applies a certain degree of intelligent interpretation to what they're seeing, and that makes everything that you encounter that's so-called representational happily not quite representational. It's very slightly alternate to reality in a really fascinating way because the person applies their industry and their voice to it all. This discussion about how much an artist incorporates her or his identity into what they're doing is really, to me, it's really interesting because it's where we are now in a good way. And we're doing it in representational work, but we're also doing it they're obviously doing it in abstract work. And I think it's good that it happened, that people recognize that there was something in the manner that was exquisitely interesting in every artist. Because I believe that's the case. This marker here is obviously in there. It's not exactly what is going on. The part of the form that I'm drawing is kind of ragged and eroded or partially disassembled. And what I'm looking at is assembling it or reassembling it so that I can get the assertion, I want to call it, that's a good word, the assertion of the cheekbone area, because I know it's there. I know the assertion of the cheekbone area will need to exist in the perspectival arrangement that I'm setting up. So that's why I've darkened this mark down for you in this discussion. There's a lot in the start, you know. Start is just, it's just fascinating how much interpretation there is in the start. So I put that in, and as I try to assemble that, I go into some of these other markers. I was talking about the circulation when last we were here, and I can darken some of that down too, you see? And that will allow me to recognize a part of this, which right now is just so soft and hard to see. Recognition will be key because I want the markers to assemble again, and when they assemble, they're sort of like a little complex of marks. Because what they will do is substantiate the architecture of all of that without literally drawing it out. That's their purpose. That's their goal. I think that's helpful, even though probably it's too dark. It's just too dark. Elsewhere, I look off to the right side. I see this kind of assemblage, as I referred to when we first started out tonight's interesting demo, hopefully. What I think this is going to do is it's going to circulate a little forward, a little sort of like it's coming out at me in space, which I like because I want there to be a feeling once more of the structure. I think I've said the word structure here about 50 times, but that's okay. That's my goal for tonight. To try to illuminate ways of reinterpreting shape so that you can indicate architecture within shape. I dedicated tonight to try to clarify what that means so that when we have another arrangement with a weird title, you can get better at that, excel at that eventually. So I want that piece of plaster there, again, complete interpretation, to circulate behind the cheekbone, which it's doing more and more of. The more I move it, the more I, in a way, kind of depart from reality. If I were an imitator, then I might not be doing this. But because I have an agenda to try to substantiate the structure, I'm going to see what happens if I try it out. And I do indeed think that it's helpful. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to go with it. That's going to take me back to this other side over here, where from my point of view, I'm noticing the prominence of the reciprocal cheekbone. So I'm going to put in a marker kind of like that. It's going to be too dark, but for this demo, it'll be sufficient. So you see, what's going on with that marker is I've got an indication right at the base of it here, and then an indication behind there of the surface. So I want the overlap to be useful. So the overlap is going to be important, and I've got a pretty good overlap there. And then I want the indication that's just to the medial side of it here to maneuver its way into a conversation, let's call it, with the eye socket. And so I'm going to go after the shapes that I think will help me, and again I'll use the word substantiate what I think I need to see here. So you see what's going on? This part there, which is again a very slight but important interpretation of that. And I'll show you primarily when I'm after this marker here within the shape. That marker is going to want to feed off of something on this side. Here's where I might get into some trouble because I have an alternate light source over here. I turned it on before the demo so that the whole drawing wouldn't be dark. But I want there to be an indication. It doesn't have to be a point, but an indication that I'm functioning with an awareness of both of these. In this cast, this is probably where the reality of the situation ends, because out here this is sort of bend of the plaster, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get much out of the form sense back there. What I think I want to do instead is issue some kind of delineation right here. It's funny that I'm finding the mark too soft. Let's try it again. That's better. So you can see now this light image here, that light accent, and what those want to do is kind of situate themselves back here and there. It's the same game, you know, it's exactly the same thing, which is see what you can do about drawing on what's happening in reality and assembling something with that information. So I've got these. I've got this transition, I've got another hatch going that way. I'll just extend it so you see what I'm doing. See the hatch going back that direction. I could then pivot because I'm interested in the subtle surface form going back here. That might be assisted by some reinterpretation of the edge of the perimeter. And so you see I'm looking at that. There's something there. It's helpful, but it's not everything. And so I'm perfectly happy going after it and saying, what if? What if I tried this? What if I tried that? So when somebody sees it, hopefully, if it looks decent enough, they're going to say, wow, it looks exactly like the real thing. But it's full of not just, errors we would say, but changes from the real thing. And hopefully they're smart changes. This dropping, same idea. There's a little kind of a flourish right there when we're around frontal eminence. From right there, we should encounter something where the side of this arrangement merges with the front. So now I'm going to replace that midline indication with a light marker. You see that light marker? And when you put that light marker in, you've got modulating asymmetry, and you've got the interest of the structural line. That light marker, which is a pretty good thing to use as a default midline, is often situated on the midline. And once it gets indicated, there's going to be another important indication right about in through there, which I'm going to use the stumped underscore. And that indication is going to be where we call it the rhinion is located. And the rhinion is going to be, now I'll switch to the pencil, it's going to be the intersection of the bone and the cartilage. So I'll go in way too dark with this for a second and show you what I'm talking about. The areas of bone and cartilage meander their way down the form, and they need to be sort of contended with, meaning you got to go in and just kind of play around until you get something that reads better. Sort of like a build out or an ovoid, perhaps, a shape like that, that is partially based on the way that the bone sweeps this direction and then turns back that direction. So you're kind of dealing with an S shape. And then the rest of it will get conducted much more idiosyncratically, because this is where people's noses really achieve character. Everybody's nose really has quite a bit of distinction in the lower nose. Then I can drag some of that down in through here. So I'm just kind of pulling on that middle tonality to build out and assemble a part that can be aligned not just with the nostril. We could do that, but I'm more interested in this conversation that we're having about markers in the shape. So I want a marker in the shape right there. Right there is what I'm talking about there. This marker. You see how I'm going darker? I'm not sure I would go darker like this in a typical approach, but because we're trying to work out a different manner of inserting structural points, many of them, and constellations for that matter, into our drawing, it's a point that can be said without causing too much corruption in your system. There's another one, and it doesn't have to be that sharp. It could be just kind of a whisper if you want it to be. But it will be interesting because it will obviously conjure up some attention in its counterpart here. And that continuing effort that we have to build a relative thing. I keep going back to this marker. I'm not exactly sure where it is. So what I'm going to do is kind of cast a line, almost like a fisherman, and see if I can pull something down here, down in this area, into the arrangement. And I think I can. I think what I'll be able to do is drive a marker there for now, and then land on something down in through here to twist my pencil around until I find a good mark. They can assemble it into a better, more cohesive line. So 1, 2, 3, that's what I'm talking about. So far I guess I'm okay, but I'll check it. What I want to do is expand all of that shape as well, because what that really is evidence of the jaw. So now I've got a marker here within the shape, whether it's beard or whatever it may be. There's a slightly organic feel to it, which is totally fine. However, I think what's helpful about this, and what I want to leave you with the impression of, is, there's other ways of triangulating than making triangles. You could go 1, 2, 3 for the triangle, obviously, and 1, 2, 3 for the triangle. Nothing wrong with that, but sometimes thinking in threes in an atypical manner is just as much triangulation, but it's tied in with a different, execution, let's say. I'm going to drop the markers. Dropping those markers even further. And once I land those pieces, which I think should indicate some of the jaw, then I'll go over to the perimeters of this area and check these perimeters and just make sure that if there's something over here or something on that side over there that I can utilize, I should find that fairly soon. So in here I pull a marker, and you see how that mark right there is not in the same direction as some of this other stuff. So I'll say again, do your absolute best to try to create distinction in the angles, as much distinction as possible, and part of that distinction will be in the overlaps. So let's make a little overlap right there, which shows the face coming out in front of the beard. That's what that overlap shows. It also potentially signals the existence of the corner of the jaw. So if I were to pull that a lot lower, you see it's kind of in there. Not exactly, but close. So let's see what we can do about indications within the rhythm of the shape here of where the jaw might be located. That's one way to help yourself find it, is to be dedicated to a, let's say, a plane for the front, plane for the transition from front over to the angle, and then a plane coming up from the angle along that we call the ramus of the jaw. And I sort of have that happening in through here. I've got the shape, which is widely, it's illuminated, so there's barely any shadow. But then I definitely, as I look around it, I can see that in through here, I've got something important. So I'm going to mark that with a darker indication. And then I'm going to drop in through here, this again, interpretive, structural shape, editing, simplification. If the hair shape on the head of the Laocoon is too complicated, then simplify it. Take on as much as you can and as much as you want. And what you don't want to, what you feel like isn't going to work, just get rid of it for now and acquire it later. Try to be selective about what you're working on. So that could indicate some of the corner of the jaw. You see, that's very helpful, right? I back away from that. I begin to see there's this sort of blend of optical phenomenon and a structural mandate. Those together, here, here. Darken this down. Now I can return to some of that beard hair shape because I've got simply a more reliable arrangement of these accents. The accents, they're designed to affirm the component parts of the jaw. So I can just stick the corner in right in through there. It should be all right for now. And then you could even go in, if you're feeling pretty solid about the arrangement, and go under the jaw, because there's a different rhythm under the jaw than there is at the jaw. At the jaw, we tend to have to go after a very architecturally important setting marker like this. This you almost always have to utilize at the base of the chin, I should say, within the jaw structure, right? And so there are various practices, and we all have tried these out, where you then split it into two, as many of you are aware. And when you split it into two, that's fine as well, because when you make the two, you kind of make a big nodule there and a big lump in through here, and those often feed the centralization of an upper form in through here. I kind of have that if you check out the hair. When you're looking for forms and you have the experience of seeing certain things within forms, you arrive with an objective vision. Then this goes in, that goes in. I can kind of circulate that marker, which is probably fine. and that circulation should land on this outside form here, right about there. That's where I want to essentially kind of drop a plumb line, and I'll drop it from the corner of the nose, and I kind of feel like that is a decent place to set it. Boy, this is a different thing than that, isn't it? But it's okay. We just kind of skipped over a slightly important thing called projected shadow. Oh well. The point I was trying to make, actually, in all seriousness, was that when you're down in this section here, so here's the rhythm of the two forms, the two structures that go into the chin, that anchor the chin, are like these two U shapes right in there. But below these, you've got a totally different shape. You've got something that's going on, which is like this. When you encounter stuff like this, it's really crazy how all that goes away. Like you see somebody try to draw this area of a person's face when it's covered by hair, and all those diagrams go out the window, and panic starts to set in. And the thing is, it's still there, because the hair is simply, it's like a shirt. It grows right on top of the bone. I mean, essentially. And so when I'm after that phenomenon, I'm going to be mindful of the rhythm part of the chin and how critically important it is to get that in here to read differently as I drop into the area that's in, I guess it's in the neck proper here. So this is the descending form below the chin, and then lifting up the ascending form below the chin. And that form actually splits into two forms when it's in the chin, here and here. Those are some guidance forms that you could look for in those areas. Well, when they go into, like when you have clothes and stuff, it's even more important to try to arrive at the situation with a kind of interpretation, like an educated guess, because you're not going to be seeing but just a few elements, but they're the elements that you need, the manubrium, right? The gladiolus, the sense of somebody's rib cage popping out underneath of the chest muscle. It can't be hidden forever, and it does come out in a clothed person, generally speaking anyway. So it could be a fun exercise to try to draw somebody that has clothing on and search for those elements. As I push and pull these pieces in here, what I'm actually trying to do most of all is be mindful of that distance so that I don't underplay the distance, because the more I can play it appropriately, the more I'll get the perspective. This is critically important to getting the read of the whole chin coming out at me in space. So I continue to drop these so I can stay literally on point. You see? Just move those markers around. As I said before, if it's all an edit, I don't care about keeping the exact marker. I care about keeping the relationship. The relationship is going to be more important, and will drive this into hopefully a better arrangement with each stroke of a pencil or brush. What I'm thinking about is some of that, putting that up in front of yourself and saying, how can I look into that dark as well as the light and analyze the intersection to embed the decisions that I make with indications, about these critical markers in the face, and how those steer the form and give me a better perspective in it. So, yep. Well, thank you all so much again for your time this evening and your consideration of my crazy idea about structural shape. We will pick it up next time. You guys, I appreciate it so much, and God bless you all. Have a wonderful night.